Picture this a hushed monastery dining hall, where the only sounds are the scrape of wooden bowls and the quiet rustle of robes. Monks sit in perfect silence, bound by sacred rules that govern every bite, every gesture. But look closer. Beneath this veneer of devotion, something extraordinary is happening. A monk leaves an extra crust of bread on the table. Another deliberately folds his hands the wrong way. Tiny acts, unnoticed by the abbot, but crackling with meaning. These weren't accidents. They were the first sparks of revolution, whispered across wooden tables and echoing far beyond monastery walls. History loves to shout about kings and battles, but some of the most powerful rebellions began in silence. Imagine the courage it took to defy an entire system without uttering a word, knowing that even a glance could betray you. These monks weren't just breaking rules, they were rewriting them, using the very rituals meant to control them as weapons of change. And here's the astonishing truth. Those small, defiant acts didn't stay hidden. Like stones dropped into still water, they rippled outward, stirring villages, towns, and entire regions to rise up. A folded napkin could become a secret signal. A deliberately misplaced spoon might rally a countryside. This is the untold story of how 24 silent rebellions, born in the most disciplined spaces on Earth, shattered the status quo. We're about to walk through dining halls where history turned, meeting the clever, daring individuals who turned mealtime into a battlefield of ideas. You'll see how a single monk's refusal to eat could topple a local lord, or how a shared glance over a bowl of soup became the blueprint for a rebellion. These weren't just meals, they were meetings, not just prayers, plans, and by the end, you'll never look at silence the same way again, so lean in. The quietest revolutions often make the loudest echoes. To understand why monasteries became hotbeds of rebellion, we need to see them as they truly were, not just quiet houses of prayer, but beating hearts of medieval life. Picture a vast network of landholdings, workshops, and scriptoriums humming with activity. Monks weren't just copying manuscripts, they were managing estates, brewing ale, and lending money. They fed the hungry, healed the sick, and advised kings. This wasn't just spirituality, it was soft power, and that's where the tension began. Local lords relied on monasteries to keep the peace, but the monks themselves were often caught between two worlds. On one side, the demands of feudal lords who saw them as tools of control. On the other, the desperate needs of villagers who viewed them as protectors. Every loaf of bread distributed, every dispute settled in the abbey's shadow, quietly shifted the balance of power. And here's the twist. The very rules meant to suppress individual will, the strict routines, the enforced silence became the perfect cover for resistance. Take the Benedictines, for example. Their vow of stability meant they couldn't flee oppressive abbots or corrupt bishops, so instead they weaponized obedience. A monk might accidentally burn the account books that justified unfair taxes. A scribe could misplace a letter demanding feudal dues. These weren't random acts of frustration. They were calculated strikes against injustice, hidden in plain sight. The monastery's reputation for holiness made it the last place anyone would suspect rebellion, and that's what made it so dangerous. Meanwhile, the Scriptorium became a secret workshop of dissent. Between copying psalms, monks penned biting satires about greedy lords or slipped subversive commentary into marginalia. A doodle of a fox in a bishop's mitre might seem harmless until you realize it's circulating to every monastery in the region. These quiet acts of defiance traveled further than any shouted protest, carried by the very networks meant to uphold the system. By the time local rulers noticed the unrest, it was often too late. The same villagers who once came to monks for blessings were now gathering in taverns, whispering about the righteous brothers who showed them another way. A single monastery's stand against grain hoarding could inspire a dozen villages to withhold rents. What began as a folded napkin in the refectory could end with torches at the Lord's gate. And all because no one thought to watch the silent ones at the table. The protest began with something as simple as a loaf of bread. At Cluny Abbey in 12th century France, where every meal was a sacred ritual, monks were expected to consume their daily ration without question, a symbol of obedience and humility. But when whispers spread that the abbey's granaries were overflowing while villagers starved, a quiet fury took root. One morning, the brothers filed into the refectory as usual, bowed their heads in prayer, and then did the unthinkable. They left their bread untouched. Not a word was spoken, not a rule was broken outwardly, yet the message was deafening. This wasn't just hunger striking back, it was a masterclass in passive resistance. By refusing to eat, the monks exposed a hidden truth. The abbey's officials had been hoarding grain to sell at inflated prices, lining their pockets while peasants paid taxes with empty bellies. The empty bowls on the table became an accusation, a silent sermon preached not from the pulpit but from the dining bench. And because the protest adhered to the letter of monastic silence, the abbot couldn't punish it without admitting the corruption existed. Word of the protest seeped beyond the cloister like water through cracks. Villagers who'd once seen the monks as part of the system now noticed their solidarity. If holy men dared to defy the abbey's greed, why shouldn't they resist their lord's demands? Soon, farmers began withholding portions of their harvest, citing the brothers' example. A tax collector found doors barred, not with violence but with folded arms and quiet resolve. The rebellion had no leader, no manifesto, just a shared understanding passed like a secret at mealtime. What made Cluny's protest so dangerous was its precision. The monks didn't storm the granary or shout demands. They used the system's own rules against it, turning the act of not eating into a weapon. And because their defiance was invisible to outsiders, just one more silent meal among thousands, it took weeks for the abbot to realize he wasn't facing disobedience, but a revolution. By then, it was too late. The granary doors were flung open, not by force but by shame, and the lesson echoed far beyond those walls. Sometimes the most powerful act is to simply leave the bread on the table. In the flickering candlelight of a Bavarian scriptorium, quills scratched across parchment with more than pious devotion. By day, the monks of St. Emmeram Abbey copied psalms and gospels like countless scribes before them. But when the abbot retired for the night, their work took a dangerous turn. Between the lines of sacred text, they began weaving something far more explosive, a hidden language of resistance. A carefully drawn margin might show a peasant's foot crushing a noble's crest. A decorated initial could conceal the face of a local tyrant in a demon's snarling mouth. And in the dense Latin commentary, phrases lifted from scripture took on new meaning. The last shall be first became a quiet call to arms. This was rebellion by illumination. The monks knew these manuscripts would travel, gifted to neighboring abbeys, read aloud in village churches, pored over by literate merchants. Every altered page became a smuggled manifesto, wrapped in the unimpeachable cloak of holy text. When a wealthy landowner proudly displayed his new psalter, he didn't realize the peasants admiring its artwork were decoding subversive symbols. A baker might point to an illustration of the rich man and Lazarus and murmur, "See how the masters keep us hungry." The very beauty that made these books treasured objects ensured their message spread further than any shouted protest. the real genius lay in plausible deniability. If challenged, the scribes could claim their artwork merely followed tradition. Wasn't it common to depict sin as a well-fed noble? Didn't the Psalms themselves speak of justice for the oppressed? By the time local lords noticed the unrest brewing, the ideas had already taken root. A weavers' guild petitioned for fair wages, citing the heavenly order from a manuscript's marginalia. Farmers withholding tithes quoted a saint's life that conveniently now emphasized sharing earthly wealth. What began as midnight edits in an isolated scriptorium became a blueprint for dissent across the region. The monastery's reputation as a guardian of truth gave these altered texts irresistible authority. When the bishop finally ordered an inspection, he found nothing obviously seditious, just impeccably copied scripture with curiously popular themes. By then, it didn't matter. The peasants needed no monk to explain the message they'd already decoded. If God's word could be reclaimed from the powerful, so could the land. And that realization, once illuminated, could never be erased. The choir's voices rose toward the vaulted ceiling of the Norman abbey, but something was wrong. Where there should have been perfect harmony, the chant wobbled with deliberate dissonance. A note held too long here, a phrase sung flat there, tiny imperfections that would have earned a monk harsh penance under normal circumstances. But this was no mistake. It was a conspiracy of sound, a rebellion hidden in plain hearing. For months, the monks had endured their abbot's cruelty, unjust beatings, withheld rations, land seized from tenant farmers to pad his coffers. Protest openly and you'd face excommunication. Stay silent and you became complicit. So they found a third way. They weaponized their worship. The liturgy demanded perfect pitch, so their intentional flaws became an indictment. At first, the abbot raged at their carelessness, ordering extra rehearsals, but the more he punished, the more the choir's discord grew, until even the villagers filling the pews noticed. And that's when the real genius of their plan unfolded. In a world where few could read, music was a universal language. The farmers and craftsmen recognized the coded cry for what it was. Soon, the parish church down the road began echoing with similarly clumsy singing. Then the next village over. Within weeks, the entire region's congregations were subtly mangling hymns, turning Sunday services into a chorus of discontent. The nobles initially dismissed it as peasant ignorance, but when tax collectors arrived to jeering crowds singing deliberately off-key hymns about justice, the message became unmistakable. The rebellion had no leader to arrest, no pamphlets to burn, just a melody that refused to conform. By the time the bishop intervened, replacing the abusive abbot, the tactic had spread beyond Normandy's borders. What made the hollow chant conspiracy so enduring was its simplicity. Unlike swords or slogans, music couldn't be confiscated. A song learned in childhood could carry rebellion for generations. And long after the original monks were gone, farmers humming an imperfect hymn at market reminded the powerful of a truth they'd rather forget. Even the most controlled voices can find ways to dissent. The smell of roasting meat would have been unthinkable during Lent in a 13th century Italian monastery, unless you knew where to listen for the laughter. Behind locked kitchen doors, monks who were supposed to be surviving on bread and water were carving whole sides of pork, pouring wine into borrowed peasant bowls, and whispering plans between bites. This wasn't just gluttony, it was a sacred conspiracy. By turning Lent's austerity on its head, these brothers weaponized generosity, transforming a season of denial into one of defiance. The rules were clear: 40 days of fasting to mirror Christ's sacrifice. But when local lords began confiscating even the peasants' Lenten rations, claiming piety while starving families, the monks saw hypocrisy too glaring to ignore. So they staged their own version of holy observance. Under cover of darkness, they smuggled cheese from the abbey's cellars, slaughtered sheep meant for the abbot's table, and baked coarse peasant bread by the dozen. Then came the real risk, inviting the hungry to join them. What made these feasts so revolutionary wasn't just the food, it was the conversations they enabled. A villager breaking bread with a monk was already breaking feudal protocol. But when that monk slid a map across the table, showing which roads tax collectors used or which storehouses were lightly guarded, the meal became a war room. The abbey's reputation for holiness gave them perfect cover. Who would suspect prayers were being replaced with battle plans? Word spread through coded messages in confessionals or a loaf left at a certain cottage door. By the time authorities caught wind, entire villages were coordinating under the guise of Lenten piety. A prayer group heading to the abbey after curfew might actually be farmers learning to barricade a bridge. A charity basket delivered to a widow's home could contain weapons beneath the bread. The genius of the Lenten feasts lay in their dual nature. To outsiders, they appeared as acts of mercy, monks easing the poor's suffering during a difficult season. But every shared bowl of stew carried a silent challenge. If those sworn to poverty could defy the powerful to feed others, why couldn't the peasants do the same? When the uprising finally came, it moved with eerie precision. Storehouses raided on the same night, tax collectors' homes surrounded simultaneously. The lords never stood a chance against an army that had trained over soup and sacramental wine. Long after the rebellion faded, the lesson lingered in village lore. The powerful could forbid gatherings, censor speeches, even burn seditious texts, but who would dare stop a holy meal? In the end, those clandestine feasts proved something terrifying to the elite. That shared food could be more dangerous than any sword, because it turned strangers into conspirators and piety into the perfect disguise for revolt. The bells of Montserrat had marked time for generations, their bronze voices calling monks to prayer, villagers to work, the countryside to order. So when they fell silent one March morning in 1382, the shock rippled through Catalonia like a physical blow. No clapper struck metal at prime, none at terce. By sext, when the field should have emptied for midday prayers, the eerie quiet had become a scream without sound. This was no mechanical failure. The Benedictines had made a calculated decision. If the church demanded yet another tax, one that would starve their dependent villages, then the church would no longer hear their bells. The absence was deliberate, devastating. Without those familiar tones marking the hours, the entire rhythm of life unraveled. Farmers hesitated to begin sowing. Merchants delayed opening stalls. Even the local lord soldiers paused at their posts, unnerved by the void where certainty should be. What made the bell strike so potent was its layered symbolism. To the archbishop, it read as spiritual disobedience, monks neglecting their sacred duty. To villagers, it was solidarity, these holy men refusing to enable oppression. And to the illiterate majority, the silence became a language all could understand. Within days, farmers began leaving plows in fields at the exact moments bells should have rung. Blacksmiths downed hammers. The entire valley enacted its own silent strike, not with shouts or barricades, but through coordinated inaction. Authorities floundered. You couldn't arrest someone for not ringing a bell or for standing quietly in a field. When soldiers demanded a miller explain why his wheel wasn't turning, the man simply pointed to the silent bell tower and shrugged. The protest's brilliance lay in its inversion. The very mechanisms of control, the bells that structured feudal life, became the tools of resistance when withheld. By the time church officials caved, reducing the tax by half, the rebellion had already birthed an enduring tactic. Years later, when a different lord tried enforcing unjust levies, villagers didn't riot. they simply stopped maintaining the roads to his castle. Like the monks before them, they'd learned the power of strategic absence. Sometimes the loudest statement is the one you don't make at all. The leather-bound ledger at Revolts Abbey seemed innocuous enough, just another record of pilgrims' offerings and prayers. But hidden between columns of coins and candle counts lay something far more explosive: meticulous notes about every injustice those pilgrims had suffered. A miller fined into starvation for grinding grain too fine. A widow's orchard seized to pay a fabricated debt. Page after page, the monks had transformed a financial record into a damning chronicle of feudal abuse, written in the trembling hands of those who had nothing left to lose. At first glance, this was simple charity work, monks offering weary travelers a sympathetic ear along with bread and shelter. But the brothers of Revolts were playing a dangerous long game. By documenting grievances in the ledger's margins, they created something unprecedented: tangible proof that individual cruelties weren't isolated incidents, but threads in a vast tapestry of exploitation. And when market day arrived, they didn't just distribute alms, they distributed truth. Standing on the abbey steps, a hooded monk would read aloud from the ledger, his voice carrying over the crowd. On the 3rd of May, Brother Elias received Thomas of York, who reports his son was taken as bondservant for a debt already paid twice over. The genius lay in the ledger's unimpeachable authority. These weren't rebel broadsides or drunken tavern complaints, but entries in an official monastic record, a document local lords themselves had blessed as holy accounting. To dismiss it risked blasphemy. To ignore it invited scrutiny from the abbey's powerful patrons. Meanwhile, peasants hearing their neighbors' suffering validated in ink realized their own troubles weren't personal failures, but systemic crimes. When the uprising came, it moved with chilling precision. Villagers arrived at tax collections with notched sticks matching ledger entries, demanding receipts. A sheriff attempting to arrest a debt-dodging blacksmith found himself surrounded by witnesses quoting pilgrimage records verbatim. The rebellion had no single leader, just 1,000 voices armed with the same damning words. By weaponizing documentation, the monks achieved what swords never could. They turned the feudal system's obsession with records against itself. A lord might burn a village, but he couldn't erase entries in a ledger copied and circulated to a dozen abbeys. And when the king's justices finally rode north to investigate, they didn't find lawless mobs. They found peasants holding inked proof of broken laws, quietly asking why written vows to protect them mattered less than written demands to impoverish them. The answer, when it came, reshaped an entire county's governance, all because some monks had dared to keep better books. Beneath the orderly rows of cabbages and medicinal rue, the monks of St. Gall Abbey were planting something far more dangerous than any weed. Officially, their cloister garden provided simples for the infirmary, humble herbs approved by church and noble alike. But tucked between the rosemary and sage grew patches of wolfsbane and belladonna, plants so potent they could ease a serf's agony or stop a lord's heart. These weren't just remedies, they were weapons disguised as foliage, cultivated in plain sight under the very noses of those who'd forbidden them. The rules were clear: only licensed physicians, invariably serving the nobility, could administer strong medicines. Peasants caught with even mild pain-relieving herbs faced flogging or worse. But when a drought brought famine and fever to the surrounding villages, the monks made their choice. Under cover of night, they began bundling forbidden plants into innocent-looking parcels of approved herbs, slipping them to trusted midwives and woodcutters with precise instructions. A poultice of henbane for the miller's shattered leg, a carefully measured dose of poppy tears for the weaver's dying child. Each delivery came with whispered lessons: which leaves to steep, which buries to avoid turning oppressed serfs into amateur apothecaries. What made this garden rebellion so insidious was its dual nature. To church inspectors, the abbey's flourishing plots demonstrated pious self-sufficiency. But to the villagers receiving clandestine care, they represented something radical: autonomy. For the first time, a serf could ease his wife's labor pains without begging permission from the castle. A shepherd could treat his flock's bloat without paying half his wool tax to the baron's physician. The very act of chewing a monk-should root for toothache became an act of defiance, proof that survival didn't require feudal approval. Word spread through coded messages: a certain flower left on a windowsill, a particular hymn hummed at market. By the time authorities grew suspicious, knowledge had taken root like dandelions in pavement cracks. When soldiers stormed one cottage to confiscate stolen medicines, they found every home in the village displaying identical herb bundles, making punishment impossible. The Lord's physician, once indispensable, now faced empty waiting rooms and simmering contempt. The true brilliance of the garden plot emerged in its aftermath. Unlike violent uprisings crushed by knights, this resistance couldn't be dug out. For every forbidden plant seized, a dozen more sprouted in hidden clearings. The serfs hadn't just gained medicine, they'd gained something far more dangerous to the feudal order: the realization that their bodies and their choices might belong to them after all. And that was a seed no sword could uproot. The Latin prayers flowing from the choir stalls of Bruges Abbey sounded flawless to the untrained ear, same resonant phrases, same solemn cadences that had echoed through centuries. But hidden within those sacred words lay a web of rearranged syllables and inverted clauses, a cipher only the educated few could unravel. When the monks chanted "Dominus providebit," the Lord will provide, their emphasis on the second word might signal a storehouse raid. A seemingly innocent shift from ora pro nobis to pro nobis ora could mark the night tax collector's plan to strike. This wasn't just liturgy, it was a linguistic minefield disguised as devotion. What made the liturgical code so devastatingly effective was its double shield of holiness and obscurity. To the local bishop listening for heresy, every word remained doctrinally pure. Only those who'd been taught, the key merchants' wives who'd learned Latin through psalters, guild scribes with church education, could hear the rebellion humming beneath the surface. A weaver might pause at his loom when the bells rang for compline, recognizing the altered paternoster as confirmation that the levy would be resisted at dawn. A blacksmith's apprentice, literate enough to follow along in his stolen prayer book, could memorize coordinates hidden in a hymn's acrostic. The monk's genius lay in weaponizing the feudal system's own tools. Latin was the language of power, of courts, contracts, and commandments from on high. By subverting it, they turned an instrument of control into one of liberation. When a nobleman's clerk transcribed the abbey's prayers for inspection, he saw only piety. But the baker's daughter, copying the same text onto scraps of parchment to circulate at market, saw instructions for where to hide grain carts before the bailiff's rounds. By the time authorities noticed the pattern villagers acting with uncanny coordination after feast days, the damage was irreversible. A bailiff demanding feudal dues might find an entire street, coincidentally, reciting the Lord's Prayer with the same deliberate errors that once rang from the abbey. The very prayers meant to instill obedience now carried the virus of resistance, replicating through whispered education. And when the count finally ordered the abbey's choir silenced, he inadvertently proved the monk's most subversive point, that even the holiest words could be dangerous when people learned to truly listen. The fishmonger monks of Dunwich Abbey knew the power of a withheld meal better than anyone. Every Lent, when the church forbade meat, their barrels of salted herring became gold, the only protein source nobles deemed fit for their pious palates. So when the local baron tripled the fishing tax, leaving villagers to gnaw on moldy grain while his court feasted, the brothers made a decision that would ripple through the entire coast. They shuttered their smokehouse. It started quietly. The abbey's usual delivery of oak-barreled fish never arrived at the castle. The monks claimed poor catches and failing nets, even as their own storerooms brimmed. Within days, the baron's cook was paying triple at market. Within a week, lesser nobles began complaining of unholy prices for even the scrawniest card. By mid-Lent, the castle's chaplain was penning frantic letters to the bishop about spiritual trials, a euphemism for nobles gnashing their teeth over empty platters. But the real stroke of genius came when the monks began redirecting their surplus. Instead of selling to the highest bidder, they traded fish directly to peasants for stories. A basket of mackerel might cost nothing more than an account of the baron's latest cruelty. A barrel of eels bought detailed maps of which villages were starving. The abbey's kitchen became an intelligence hub, with every transaction quietly exposing the ruling class's greed. Soon, the boycott spread beyond the cloister. Fishermen who once competed for noble contracts now accidentally tore their nets when the baron's men came calling. Tavern keepers served spoiled ale to tax collectors, claiming the fish shortage left nothing to preserve the barrels. The economic noose tightened with poetic justice. The very system designed to extract wealth from the poor now turned against its creators. What made the Fishmonger monks' rebellion so devastating was its simplicity. Unlike violent uprisings that united nobles against a common threat, this was a war of whispers and withheld goods. When the baron finally rode to the abbey in fury, he found brothers peacefully mending nets and a crowd of villagers lingering nearby, their belts looser than in years past. The message was clear: the sea's bounty belonged to those who respected its harvesters, and sometimes revolution smelled like salt and oak smoke. The flicker of candlelight in an Irish monastery after dark should have meant nothing more than monks at their prayers. But in the winter of 1396, those trembling flames illuminated something far more dangerous: pages of scripture being reinterpreted for rebellion. The Cistercians of Mellifont Abbey knew their nightly vigils were watched by English officials, so they crafted the perfect disguise. Kneeling with open psalters, they appeared to meditate on heaven while actually dissecting verses about liberation. Moses leading slaves from Egypt, Deborah rallying armies against oppressors. The same passages that justified feudal rule when preached by day became blueprints for resistance by candlelight. What made these vigils so potent was their dual audience. Illiterate clansmen invited to pray would hear a monk's voice lifting a familiar psalm. "The Lord hears the cry of the poor," followed by whispered commentary linking it to their stolen harvests. A nobleman spying through the cloister windows saw only bowed heads. The local blacksmith leaning in the shadows caught the coded message about hiding weapons in peat stacks. The monks weaponized their reputation for holiness, knowing no English soldier would dare interrupt what looked like sacred rites. Soon, the candlelight spread beyond abbey walls. Fishermen holding beachside vigils used the flicker of their lamps to signal when patrol boats passed. A village baker might leave a single candle burning in his window, not for lost souls, but to mark where rebel messages were hidden in loaves. The English dismissed these as peasant superstitions until entire regions began moving in eerie unison, their coordination attributed to miraculous timing. The rebellion's true genius lay in its spiritual scaffolding. When English commanders demanded the abbey cease its seditious preaching, the abbot produced impeccably orthodox sermon notes. The real teachings lived orally, passed from monk to clansman like the Lord's Prayer itself. By the time authorities realized the vigils were more than piety, the flame had already jumped the ditch, igniting a resistance that couldn't be snuffed out with swords because it burned in the dark where no one could prove it existed at all. The alms bowl passed from hand to hand in a Seville monastery, its copper surface gleaming with the coins of penitents seeking heavenly favor. But those same coins given in good faith to feed the poor were about to fund something far more earthly, a rebellion against the Spanish crown. For years, monks in Andalusia had watched as royal tax collectors bled dry the very communities the church swore to protect. When protests earned only harsher reprisals, the brothers devised an ingenious solution. They would turn piety into pragmatism, transforming alms into arms without breaking a single holy vow. On paper, every Moravdi remained accounted for. The abbey's ledgers showed meticulous records of bread distributed to beggars, medicines purchased for the infirmary, dowries provided for orphan girls. But hidden in plain sight were subtle discrepancies, a few extra loaves here, an inflated price for simples there, tiny leaks in the system that funneled silver toward rebel coffers. A blind widow might receive not just alms, but instructions to pass a message to her son in the hills. A charitable donation of seed grain could mysteriously find its way to villages known for sheltering dissenters. The brilliance of this alms rebellion lay in its dual nature. To royal inspectors, the monks appeared as model custodians of charity, their account books pristine. But to the shoeless farmer receiving a suspiciously heavy purse for his daughter's wedding, the message was clear: God's money would serve God's justice. Even the crown's own officials hesitated to scrutinize pious gifts too closely, lest they be accused of sacrilege. Soon, the system grew more sophisticated. Certain feast days saw alms distributed in specific sequences, a signal about when to strike a tax collector's house. A beggar counting coins outside a cathedral might casually drop the total amount, alerting listeners to how many rebels were hiding nearby. The very rituals meant to reinforce feudal piety became its undoing, as coins intended to buy salvation instead purchased freedom. When the uprising finally erupted, it moved with startling coordination. Tax offices burned simultaneously across 3 provinces. Royal warehouses were emptied by crowds shouting the same biblical verses the monks had preached for months. The crown's investigators, tearing through abbey records, found nothing but impeccable charity. Yet somehow, every rebel seemed to carry a freshly minted dagger. In the end, the alms rebellion exposed a truth that terrified the powerful: that faith could be a currency more potent than gold, and that those who controlled its flow might wield it in ways no ledger could ever capture. Long after the rebellion was crushed, Spanish nobles eyed their monks with new suspicion, wondering if every clink in the collection plate was really buying bread for the poor or bullets for the next revolution. The Psalter's margins were never meant for politics, at least not according to the Scottish bishops who distributed them. But in the hands of the Augustinian canons of Holyrood Abbey, those blank edges became a battleground. When King James I imposed yet another crippling tax on wool exports, the monks didn't take to the streets or pen angry letters. Instead, they picked up their quills and began annotating. Tiny, meticulous notes sprouted beside verses about justice. See 1 Kings 12, where Rehoboam's heavy yoke split a kingdom, inked next to Psalm 72's promise to defend the cause of the poor. To the untrained eye, it was mere scholarly commentary. To the wool merchants and weavers who received these gifted psalters, it was a call to arms written in holy ink. What made the Psalter protest so ingenious was its veneer of legitimacy. These weren't clandestine pamphlets that could be burned as sedition. They were sacred texts, personally blessed by the abbot and distributed through proper channels. A nobleman might flip through one in his chapel, oblivious to the rebellion humming in its footnotes. But the cloth dyers reading those same margins would catch the message immediately. If King Rehoboam's greed caused Israel's revolt, what might King James' taxes provoke? The monks had turned scripture into a mirror, reflecting contemporary tyranny through ancient stories. Soon, the annotations grew bolder. A particularly vicious tax decree coincided suspiciously with psalters circulating with Job's lament, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away," underlined in red, followed by a tiny sketch of a crown with frayed threads. When authorities finally noticed the pattern, they faced an impossible dilemma. Confiscating the books would outrage the faithful. Ignoring them allowed the dissent to spread. Their eventual compromise, issuing corrected psalters with the margins scraped clean, only amplified the scandal. Parish priests found themselves besieged by congregants demanding to know why the church was censoring God's word. The rebellion's true victory lay in its viral nature. A merchant might copy a particularly biting gloss into his ledger. A farmer's daughter could stitch subversive verses into her embroidery patterns. By the time wool workers organized their famous tax strike, their banners quoted not rebel slogans, but the very psalms the king's own chaplains had taught them to revere. The monks had weaponized literacy itself, proving that sometimes the quietest dissent is written between the lines where only those who truly need to see it will look. The barrels rolled out of Burgundy's monasteries on schedule, oak staves gleaming, wax seals unbroken, but something was terribly wrong when they reached noble tables. The wine inside, usually rich with the warmth of sun-soaked grapes, tasted thin and sour. Some casks held nothing but vinegar, others a watered-down shadow of their former glory. The confused steward who sampled them never suspected the quiet sabotage underway, nor that the monks who blessed each shipment had also cursed them with calculated imperfection. For generations, Burgundy's vineyards had been the crown jewel of aristocratic wealth, their wines flowing like liquid gold to royal courts across Europe. But while nobles toasted their good fortune, the workers who tended the vines labored under backbreaking conditions, paid in scraps while their masters grew fat on the profits. When pleas for fair wages went unanswered, the region's monastic winemakers, keepers of centuries-old fermentation secrets, chose a weapon no one expected. They ruined the vintage without breaking a single law. The methods were as subtle as they were devastating. A cask destined for the Duke's table might be accidentally stored near a heat source, turning prized Pinot Noir to cooked jam. Another batch would undergo suspiciously rapid fermentation, leaving it clouded and bitter. The monks' expertise made the sabotage undetectable until the first sip, and their holy reputations shielded them from suspicion. Who would accuse men of God of tampering with divine gifts? But the real stroke of genius came when the monks began educating vineyard workers in their craft. Under the guise of teaching proper grape handling, they revealed how temperature fluctuations or delayed pressing could subtly alter quality. Soon, entire harvests bore the marks of quiet resistance, clusters left too long in the sun, presses run too hastily. By the time nobles noticed the pattern, their cellars were stocked with undrinkable swill, and their frantic searches for culprits led nowhere. Every worker could honestly claim they'd followed orders to the letter. The economic shockwave was immediate. With no fine wine to sell or serve, aristocrats faced empty coffers and humiliating questions from disappointed kings. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the vineyards. If the monks could humble dukes with spoiled barrels, what might organized workers achieve? When the next harvest began, laborers set down their baskets in unison, demanding a share of the profits their hands created. Unlike violent revolts crushed by knights, this rebellion left no bruises to show the crown, only a trail of sour wine and shattered expectations. The nobles, desperate to restore their precious trade, had no choice but to negotiate. And the monks, they returned to crafting exquisite vintages, once their people's dignity had been poured into the bargain. Long after the strikes ended, the lesson lingered in Burgundy's cellars. Even the mightiest lords are powerless when the hands that sustain them decide to withhold their skill. And sometimes the sweetest revenge tastes remarkably like vinegar. The leather-bound volume sat innocently in the abbey's scriptorium for decades, just another chronicle of feast days, harvests, and the occasional miracle. But tucked between accounts of rainfall and royal visits, the monks of Einsiedeln Abbey had recorded something far more explosive. Every bribe demanded by visiting bishops, every sacred relic sold to line pockets, every peasant whipped for failing to pay tithes already paid twice over. These weren't grievances, they were meticulous records written in dry Latin as if noting the weather. Until the day a novitiate with a grudge and a merchant cousin decided ink could do more than remember, it could expose. The smuggling operation was laughably simple. A baker delivering bread to the abbey left with a loaf hollowed out to hold vellum scraps. A wool merchant bound for Zurich carried a shipment of account books with damning entries hidden between fabric samples. Within weeks, excerpts from the Chronicle were being read aloud in guild halls, copied onto broadsheets, even pinned to church doors under cover of darkness. The effect was volcanic. Farmers who'd assumed their suffering was isolated now saw the pattern how bishops sow, and so took a special offering after Easter in every village along the Rhine, how abbot such and such diverted famine relief to buy his nephew a benefice. The church's corruption wasn't just systemic, it was documented in its own servants' handwriting. What made the Chronicle leaks so devastating was their unimpeachable source. These weren't rebel accusations but the abbey's own records, penned by monks sworn to truth. When bishops denounced the broadsheets as forgeries, townsfolk demanded to know why holy men would lie about rainfall and rye yields but suddenly fabricate entries about embezzlement. The more fiercely authorities tried to suppress the Chronicle, the faster it multiplied, copied by scriveners, memorized by traveling actors, even turned into rhyming couplets for illiterate laborers to chant at market. Reformers who'd struggled for years found their cause catapulted forward overnight. A preacher railing against clerical greed could now point to specific dates and amounts. A councillor blocking new taxes merely had to quote the abbey's notes on where last year's levies really went. The rebellion had no leader to arrest, no press to confiscate, just facts spreading like water through cracks in a dam. By the time the Pope sent investigators, the damage was irreversible. Peasants withholding tithes cited Chronicle entries proving their payments had been stolen. Towns once loyal to bishops now demanded elected auditors, and the monks of Einsiedeln, they kept writing, their quills scratching out the quiet truth that power fears most, that when records are kept faithfully, even the smallest hand can topple empires. The chisel strike seemed ordinary enough, another day of shaping saints and scripture into the abbey's limestone facade. But if you knew where to look, the masons of Cluny weren't just carving piety into stone, they were etching revolution. High above the bishop's throne, amid the usual foliage and holy figures, a careful observer might spot something unsettling, an angel's drapery subtly forming the shape of a clenched fist. A decorative vine that, when sunlight struck at noon, cast the unmistakable shadow of a sickle. These weren't mistakes, they were messages in plain sight, hidden because no one expected art to tell the truth. For generations, the guild's masters had passed down a dangerous tradition, teaching apprentices to weave dissent into the sacred geometry of the church itself. A capital depicting Samson toppling pillars might include a suspiciously modern-looking nobleman among the Philistines. the face of a demon writhing in hell could bear an uncanny resemblance to the local tax collector. The carvers worked so slowly, so deliberately, that their subversion went unnoticed for years after all. Who scrutinizes every leaf and fold in a building meant to stand for centuries? The real genius lay in how these symbols spread awareness without words. A peasant kneeling in the nave might glance up and suddenly really see, the stone harvest scene where a serf's basket overflowed while the Lord's hands dripped gold. A traveling merchant resting in the cloister could trace the odd pattern of a mitre cord and realize it mapped the very roads tax collectors used. Unlike pamphlets that could be burned or speeches that might earn a whipping, this rebellion was literally set in stone, waiting for eyes ready to understand. When authorities finally caught on, they faced an impossible dilemma. Tearing down the carvings would mean admitting they held meaning, and risking outrage from believers who'd grown up revering those same walls. So the symbols stayed, whispering to each new generation. By the time the peasant revolts erupted across France, many fighters swore they'd first felt rebellion stirring not in taverns or fields, but in the quiet shadow of an abbey wall, where stone serfs eternally raised their tools against stone kings. Long after the revolts were crushed, the carvings endured mute witnesses to a truth the powerful never fully grasped. That art outlives its creators, and even the most carefully controlled spaces can't suppress the human hunger to be seen. The masons may have died anonymous, but their hands had given illiterate thousands a language sharper than any sword, one that couldn't be silenced because it was written in the very bones of the world. The pilgrim's cloak was the perfect disguise, threadbare at the hem, smelling of wood smoke and road dust, its pockets stuffed with nothing more suspicious than a rosary and a crust of black bread. No border guard would suspect the shivering boy kneeling at a roadside shrine was actually a master courier, his sackcloth belt hiding tiny scrolls that could topple a dozen noble houses. Across 15th century Poland, where every road swarmed with genuine penitents headed to Częstochowa or Gniezno, the church's own traditions became the scaffolding for revolution. Young novices were the ideal operatives, still beardless, often slight from years of monastic fasting. They blended seamlessly into the streams of pilgrims flooding holy sites. Their movements drew no suspicion what lord would question a boy begging alms for his abbey, but beneath those bowed heads buzzed minds sharpened by scriptorium training, capable of memorizing complex routes, coded phrases, even entire manifests of rebel arms. A novice lingering too long at a well might be counting grain carts bound for a rebel holdout. A whispered request for Saint Adalbert's blessing could signal which bridges were unguarded come nightfall. The system's brilliance lay in its decentralized design. Each messenger knew only his immediate contacts, making the network impossible to unravel even if captured. Scrolls were written in lemon juice that vanished unless heated, messages stitched into the hems of donated vestments. At pilgrimage sites, information passed through accidental collisions near relic displays or prayers recited just loudly enough to carry. By the time authorities noticed novices returning with suspiciously full alms pouches, coins heavy enough to fund a rebellion, the web had already spun itself into a dozen dioceses. One particularly daring operation saw 3 novices from different abbeys coincidentally converge on the same roadside chapel near Krakow. To any observer, they were simply youth sharing bread. In reality, they were exchanging not just messages but tactics, how village blacksmiths could forge pikes that looked like hayforks, which forest paths avoided royal patrols. Their most dangerous innovation, using confessionals as dead drops, where whispered sins about impure thoughts actually detailed which nobleman's cellar held hidden grain stores. When the uprising finally erupted, it moved with eerie synchronicity. Tax collectors found empty villages, their residents vanished into woods the novices had mapped. Armories were stripped bare by rebels who seemed to know every guard rotation. The Crown's investigators, tearing apart monasteries, found only pious youths copying psalms because the real weapons weren't hidden in cells, but in the minds of boys who'd turned pilgrimage routes into arteries of revolt. Long after the rebellion was crushed, the tactic endured in whispers. 100 years later, when Polish nobles tried reviving serfdom, they faced an unexpected obstacle. Pilgrims arriving at castles with odd questions about scripture, their wide eyes missing nothing. Some traditions once taught cannot be unlearned, especially when they travel on sandaled feet, singing hymns all the way to the barricades. The ink smelled wrong. Any experienced scribe would have noticed the wrong acidity from the oak gall, the faintest shimmer of modern copper in the pigment. But the Count's bailiffs weren't scribes, and that was precisely what the Benedictines of Pannonhalma Abbey were counting on. When a delegation of Hungarian serfs arrived at the castle clutching rediscovered land deeds, the documents looked convincingly ancient, yellowed with walnut stain, edges nibbled by time, seals painstakingly recreated from wax mixed with grave dirt for that perfect crackled patina. The forgery was flawless because the forgers had spent lifetimes copying sacred texts. Who better to craft a holy lie? This wasn't just parchment deception, it was psychological warfare. The monks knew nobles relied on written deeds more than swords to justify their thefts, so they weaponized that very trust, exploiting a quirk of feudal law. Any document unchallenged for 40 days became legally binding. By the time the Count realized the 12th century charter, granting 3 villages back to the plowman was fake, the deadline had passed. His fury was impotent. Accusing the abbey of fraud risked inviting scrutiny of his own family's dubiously acquired titles. The operation's brilliance lay in its layers. Some forgeries were gifts from the abbey's archives, rediscovered during pious cleanings. Others were slipped into noble libraries by sympathetic tutors to be found by accident. A particularly bold stroke involved hiring itinerant players to stage a crumbling wall in the Count's own castle, revealing a hidden cache of deeds that just happened to void his claims. Each document contained tiny flaws only a trained eye would spot. A saint's feast day listed before its official canonization, a border design popularized decades after the purported date. Flaws that, if exposed, would trace back to the Count's poor stewardship rather than monkish hands. But the real rebellion wasn't in the ink. It was in the serfs' sudden confidence when standing before magistrates, quoting clauses they'd memorized from their ancestral charters. It was in the way a blacksmith's daughter, taught to read by the monks, could now point to a line about grazing rights and dare the bailiff to contradict her. The forgeries didn't just return land, they returned agency, proving that words on parchment could be sharper than scythes when wielded with precision. By the time the Crown cracked down, the damage was done. Whole districts had learned to demand proof for every noble claim, to scrutinize seals with new suspicion. And the monks, they burned their forgery tools in the abbey furnace, their lesson already etched deeper than any counterfeit, that sometimes the most sacred act is to make the powerful doubt the very documents that made them powerful. The great clock of St. Hilda's Abbey had marked time for 200 years, its iron hands measuring prayers, not prophets, its chime calling souls to contemplation rather than servitude. So when the local lord's bailiffs seized control of the mechanism, recalibrating it to toll every hour for mandatory field labor, the monks didn't protest aloud. They simply waited for midnight when the bailiff slept and removed the clock's heart, a single, irreplaceable gear hidden in the folds of a novice's robe. By dawn, the tower stood silent, its face frozen at the exact moment time had become tyranny. At first, the authorities assumed mechanical failure, but when their own smiths, men who'd never worked on anything finer than plowshares, couldn't repair the intricate device, suspicion grew. The monks offered innocent shrugs. Perhaps the old clock, like the villagers, was simply exhausted. The Lord's solution, stationing a drummer in the square to mimic the lost bells, only deepened the absurdity. Without the abbey's authority behind the strokes, the rhythms felt hollow, arbitrary. Workers who'd once jumped at the first chime now paused, squinting at shadows to guess the hour. The fields filled later, emptied earlier. What began as technical sabotage blossomed into psychological liberation. Freed from the clock's tyranny, villagers rediscovered older rhythms, tilling while dew still softened the soil, resting when the sun hung highest. The Lord's furious decree that laborers must now carry hourglasses to prove their toil backfired spectacularly when the devices accidentally shattered in unison one market day. Time itself had become a battleground, and the monks were winning by refusing to play. The rebellion's most brilliant flourish came from an unexpected quarter, the abbey's choir. By long-standing tradition, they sang the little hours prime, terce, sext, at intervals loosely tied to the sun's position. Now they leaned into that flexibility. On days when the Lord's overseers pressed hardest, the hymns stretched languidly, granting workers extra minutes of shade. When inspections loomed, the songs clipped brisk, signaling villagers to scatter. The liturgy became a living clock, its cadence controlled by those who understood time as a gift, not a commodity. By harvest season, the standoff reached its quiet climax. The Lord, desperate to reassert control, ordered a new clock built, only to find every craftsman in the region suddenly indisposed. Meanwhile, the abbey's original gear reappeared as mysteriously as it had vanished, nestled in the offering plate with a note: "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." The restored mechanism struck the hours once more, but with a crucial difference. Its labor chimes now rang a half-beat slower, a subtle edit that stretched every workday just enough to matter. In the end, the clock tower standoff proved something radical. That time, when stripped of coercion, could be reclaimed by those who lived it. The villagers never outright refused to work. They simply reminded their overlords that no bell could ring obedience into a soul that had learned to listen to its own rhythm. And that lesson, once learned, kept ticking long after the last bailiff gave up counting. The barrels stood empty in the Trappist cellars of Westmalle Abbey, their usual rich aromas of yeast and hops replaced by an eerie stillness. For the first time in living memory, the monks had broken their sacred brewing schedule, not for lack of devotion, but as an act of holy defiance. Across medieval Belgium, where monastic ale was more than drink but currency itself, this sudden drought sent shockwaves through the halls of power. Noblemen who'd grown fat taxing every pint found their coffers drying up faster than the abandoned fermentation tanks. This was no accident of spoiled grain or broken equipment. The brothers had convened in secret chapter, weighing their vow of obedience against the cries of farmers whose barley was seized to feed noble excess. Their decision was unanimous. If the lords wanted to treat God's gift as mere commodity, they would learn what happened when the source ran dry. The strike began without fanfare, just unsold wort poured onto abbey gardens, just casks left unsealed to sour in the damp cellars. But the economic tremor was immediate. Ale was the lifeblood of feudal commerce. Soldiers took pay in pints, rents were negotiated over tankards, and guild meetings dissolved without their traditional toast. Within weeks, tax collectors struggled to squeeze coin from tavern keepers with empty taps. Wedding feasts turned tense when no ceremonial kegs arrived. Even the castle guards grew surly, their daily ration reduced to watery small beer. The lords scoffed at first what threat could praying brewers pose, until their own treasurers reported a chilling truth. Nearly a third of the region's wealth had evaporated like alcohol in an open vat. What made the brewers' strike so devastating was its spiritual armor. When enraged nobles demanded the monks explain themselves, the abbot merely cited chapter 34 of Saint Benedict's rule, "Let all things be done with moderation." If the lords wanted their ale, they argued, perhaps they should practice the virtue of temperance. The retort left aristocrats seething but powerless. How could they force holy men to break their own vows? Meanwhile, the strike taught villagers an electrifying lesson about collective power. Blacksmiths who'd once bribed officials with barrels now withheld their labor until grain taxes eased. Bakers began forgetting to deliver loaves to tax collectors' homes. The rebellion had no need for violence when thirst could do the work more effectively. By the time the first noble capitulated, restoring seized farmland in exchange for the abbey's blessed resumption of brewing, the pattern was set. Long after the barrels flowed again, the whispers lingered in Belgian taverns. Every time a merchant haggled over ale prices or a farmer withheld his malt to protest unfair levies, they remembered the monks who proved even the holiest traditions could ferment revolution. And somewhere in the abbey's dim cellars, as brothers stirred new batches with quiet smiles, the lesson lived on. Sometimes the mightiest weapon is simply knowing what happens when you stop making what the powerful crave. The quills lay still in the Scriptorium of Alcobaça Abbey, a silence more defiant than any shouted protest. For generations, Portugal's royal decrees had flowed through monastic hands, scribes dutifully copying laws onto parchment, their ink lending divine legitimacy to even the harshest edicts. But when King Afonso V demanded yet another tax to fund his wars, the brothers made a revolutionary choice. They set down their pens, no fiery speeches, no torn parchments. Just empty desks and unfinished work, as if time itself had frozen in the cloister. At first, the king's clerks assumed simple delay, but as weeks passed with no new copies of the tax decree reaching regional courts, the implications grew terrifying. Without properly transcribed and sealed documents, the law held no force. Tax collectors found themselves waving unsigned orders at skeptical villagers who shrugged and quoted tradition. No monk's seal, no king's command. The bureaucratic machine, so reliant on holy scribes to function, ground to a halt. The monks' genius lay in their weaponization of routine. By merely not doing what they'd always done, they exposed the fragility of royal power. A bailiff could arrest a rabble-rouser, but how did one punish absence? The abbot, when confronted, merely bowed his head and murmured about prayerful discernment and the heavy burden of unjust words. To accuse him of sedition would mean admitting the crown depended on clerics to rule, a truth no monarch wanted aired. Meanwhile, the sit-in spread like spilled ink. In Coimbra, scribes began losing key passages from decrees, rendering them meaningless. A Lisbon scriptorium ran out of parchment whenever tax laws arrived. The rebellion's brilliance was its deniability. Every participant could claim incompetence or accident, while collectively strangling the machinery of oppression. Even lay copyists joined the quiet revolt, their errors growing suspiciously creative. One particularly bold clerk transposed digits in a tax ledger, reducing a lord's due from 500 coins to 50. The standoff reached its climax when a royal delegation stormed Alcobaça, only to find the Scriptorium eerily transformed. Monks knelt in prayer where desks once stood, their hands conspicuously inkless. The king's men spluttered demands, but the abbot simply gestured to the empty room. "We are but humble servants of the word," he said, and some words, it seems, are not ours to write. By the time Afonso relented, reducing the tax by a third, an irreversible lesson had taken root. The villagers who once trembled at royal seals now peered at them with newfound scrutiny, asking who had written them and who had refused. Power, they realized, didn't just flow from the throne. It flowed through the hands that recorded it, and sometimes the most subversive act was to simply let those hands lie still. The pilgrim staffs were supposed to be unbreakable, blessed symbols of sacred journeys, carved from the heartwood of ancient oaks. But in the Alpine monasteries of Austria, where pilgrims paused to receive these hallowed walking sticks before crossing noble lands, a quiet conspiracy took root. Monks began carefully scoring the staves just below the grip, weakening them with nearly invisible grooves that wouldn't betray their treachery until the moment of truth. To a weary traveler leaning on the wood, it held firm. But when a haughty baron or tax collector commandeered the staff to beat a peasant or steady himself in his saddle, the shaft would snap spectacularly, sending him tumbling into the mud before a crowd of suddenly emboldened onlookers. This wasn't just petty revenge, it was psychological warfare disguised as divine intervention. The staffs, after all, bore the monastery's seal, making their failure seem like God's judgment rather than sabotage. A nobleman sprawled in the dirt couldn't accuse the abbey of treason without admitting his own arrogance in mishandling a holy object. Meanwhile, villagers who witnessed these humiliations began whispering that the very earth rejected their oppressor's weight. The monks had turned a simple stick into a theatrical prop for cosmic justice. The operation's brilliance lay in its plausible deniability. If questioned, the brothers merely shrugged and suggested the noble must have gripped the staff with impure hands. When lords demanded sturdier versions, the monks provided them outwardly flawless, but weighted unevenly so they twisted unpredictably in the saddle. Some even contained hidden compartments of foul-smelling herbs that released their odor when jostled too roughly, leaving riders trailing an invisible cloud of mockery. Soon the rebellion spread beyond the monasteries. Blacksmiths crafted pilgrim badges with hidden burrs that pricked noble fingers. Farmers left suspiciously hollowed-out logs near bridges where officials liked to pause and lecture. The once unassailable aura of feudal authority began to crack like a scored staff under pressure, each splinter proving that even the smallest acts of defiance could topple giants if you knew exactly where to carve the weakness. Long after the practice faded, the lesson lingered in Alpine folktales. A lord's horse might shy at nothing, or his banner tear mysteriously in still air, and old men would nod wisely, remembering the monks who taught them that sometimes the holiest weapons are the ones that break at just the right moment. The Feast of Fools was supposed to be harmless, a single day each winter when the church allowed its lowest members to briefly wear the hats of their superiors. When choir boys became bishops and servants ruled the roost. Laughter echoed through cathedral cloisters as solemn rituals were playfully inverted, all under the watchful eye of tradition. But in the hands of certain monastic troops, this sanctioned silliness became something far more dangerous, a velvet glove hiding an iron fist of dissent. Take the performance staged by the canons of St. Stephen's in 1426. What began as the usual bawdy romp, a novice stumbling about in oversized vestments, a donkey led to the altar, suddenly took a sharp turn. A masked figure resembling the local duke stumbled onto the makeshift stage, his crown stuffed with straw, his speeches peppered with unmistakable quotes from recent tax decrees. The crowd's giggles turned to gasps, then to roaring approval as the actor Duke tripped into a trough of pig slop, his pompous proclamations drowned by squeals. The joke landed like a well-aimed trebuchet, not because it was clever, but because everyone recognized the truth beneath the grease paint. What made these theatrical rebellions so potent was their dual nature. Church authorities couldn't crack down without violating their own tolerance for the feast days' chaos. Noblemen who might hang a peasant for insulting them in the street found themselves paralyzed. How did one punish laughter that technically honored tradition? Meanwhile, villagers who'd never dare speak against their lords now memorized every satirical rhyme, repeating them in taverns where no masks were needed. The plays became echo chambers, amplifying grievances under the guise of merriment. The monks' genius lay in their casting. When a particularly cruel tax collector found his mannerisms perfectly mimicked by a gangly novice, or when a bishop's favorite sermon about humility was delivered by an actor with his robes worn inside out, the message bypassed reason and struck straight at emotion. Fear dissolved in the furnace of collective ridicule. A lord who seemed invincible at the head of an army became absurd when portrayed with a sausage for a scepter. By the time authorities tried banning specific tropes, no more noble characters, no contemporary references, the damage was done. The feast might end, but the mental images lingered, the mighty rendered ridiculous, their power exposed as performance. And in that realization lay the seed of something revolutionary, that if authority could be mocked, perhaps it could also be denied. Long after the last mask was stored away, villagers found new courage in remembering how their overlords had looked covered in flour and false bravado, their grandeur just a costume waiting to be torn away. The vault beneath the Strahov Monastery was no ordinary storeroom. Its walls, lined with false shelves and hidden compartments, held a treasure more dangerous than any gold. For decades, the Bohemian monks had played a delicate game of preservation, smuggling banned texts into their sanctuary under the noses of church inspectors. A vernacular Bible here, a treatise on clerical corruption there, each volume carefully wrapped in plain parchment and tucked between approved works like contraband in a smuggler's coat. To the untrained eye, their library was a model of orthodoxy, but beneath the surface it crackled with radical thought, a silent arsenal of ideas waiting for their moment. The monks' methods were as ingenious as they were covert. Some forbidden texts were disguised as harmless manuscripts, their controversial passages written in lemon juice that only appeared when held to candlelight. Others were disassembled and rebound into multiple innocuous volumes, their true message only legible when read in a specific sequence. A particularly bold innovation involved hollowing out the thick wooden covers of approved psalters to conceal slender pamphlets inside heresy hiding in plain sight, protected by the very holiness of its container. When church authorities finally uncovered the cache during a surprise inspection in 1407, the fallout was immediate. The bishop's men recoiled at the sheer volume of Dissent, not just Hussite writings, but works by Wycliffe, Waldensian tracts, even crude woodcuts depicting the Pope as the whore of Babylon. But their horror was matched by the monks' quiet triumph. For every text seized, a dozen copies had already slipped into circulation, passed hand to hand like lit coals in a drought. The banned ideas they'd safeguarded now burned through Bohemia with wildfire intensity. What made this rebellion unique was its delayed detonation. Unlike spoiled wine or sabotaged bells, the monks' work required patience, years of curating, copying, and concealing before their efforts bore fruit. But when the Hussite reforms erupted, their hidden library became the movement's intellectual fuel. Peasant preachers quoted texts the church had tried to erase. University debates crackled with arguments preserved in those secret pages. Even the monks' own trial backfired spectacularly when their defiant testimony, laced with phrases from the banned works, spread through Prague faster than the authorities could suppress it. The real legacy of Strahov's hidden library wasn't just in the texts themselves, but in the lesson they carried, that ideas once set loose cannot be unread. Long after the monastery's walls were stripped bare, the words they'd sheltered lived on in the mouths of reformers, the margins of legal texts, the memories of those who'd touched them. The monks had understood what their persecutors did not, that the most dangerous rebellions aren't fought with swords, but with sentences, and that sometimes preserving a single page can change the weight of history. The hearthfires burned unusually late that winter night, not for warmth, but for purification. In abbeys from Normandy to Navarre, monks gathered not in prayer, but in quiet conspiracy, each clutching identical bundles of parchment. These weren't sacred texts, but the very instruments of oppression: feudal contracts, tax rolls, debt indentures, all carefully smuggled from noble archives or copied in secret scriptoria. As midnight bells tolled across Christendom, 1,000 hands fed the flames simultaneously, turning inked tyranny into curling smoke. What made this act revolutionary wasn't just the destruction, but what came after. As embers glowed, the brothers did something astonishing. They gathered the cooled ashes into silver reliquaries, mixing them with holy water and chrism oil to anoint the crude banners of peasant revolts. The message was unmistakable: what the powerful had written to enslave, the faithful had transformed into sacramental fuel for liberation. This was no spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of years of silent coordination. Novices traveling between abbeys had carried coded psalms with hidden dates. Baker monks slipped instructions into hollowed loaves. Even the seemingly random assignment of priests to distant parishes served its purpose, creating a web of trusted messengers across linguistic and political borders. When the appointed night arrived, the synchronization was eerie. A count in Burgundy awoke to find his storied lineage suddenly legally nebulous, the marriage contracts proving his ancestral land claims reduced to soot in Saint Saëns' fireplace. A Spanish duke's meticulous debt records vanished from Montserrat's Scriptorium, only to reappear as blackened streaks on rebel foreheads near Barcelona. The true genius lay in the rebellion's spiritual alchemy. By turning ash into blessing, the monks performed something radical. They redefined what was sacred. No longer were vellum seals and royal signatures the ultimate authority. Now, the residue of their destruction became holy. When peasant armies marched under those soot-streaked banners, they weren't just defying earthly lords. They were enacting divine will as interpreted by God's own scribes. A serf gripping a spear could look at the dark cross on his standard and know this was consecrated by the same hands that transcribed the Gospels. Authorities floundered in response. Punishing the monks meant explaining why feudal documents needed protection in holy places, admitting the church had been complicit in oppression. Some abbots feigned outrage, blaming overzealous junior brothers. Others openly declared the burnings acts of conscience, daring bishops to excommunicate entire monasteries. The chaos created perfect cover for the rebellion's next phase. Villagers using the legal vacuum to seize fields, declaring them God's land, now that no parchment proved otherwise. Long after the revolt subsided, the lesson lingered like hearth smoke in wool. Future lords would eye monastic scribes with newfound suspicion, no longer certain if their quills recorded history or quietly prepared its unraveling. And in village taverns, old men would tell of the winter night when fire proved mightier than ink, and the quiet ones who tended the flames held more power than any king with a seal. From altered hymns to secret feasts, these 24 rebellions prove that revolution doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the scrape of a wooden bowl, the scratch of a quill, the carefully folded hands of those who refuse to play by the rules. Monastic tables, those sacred spaces meant to enforce obedience, became unlikely battlefields where breadcrumbs held coded messages, where ink stained not just parchment but the conscience of an era. The true brilliance of these revolts wasn't in their scale, but in their subtlety. A single missed note in a hymn could unravel a noble's authority. A loaf of bread left uneaten could starve an entire system of its power. What makes these stories so enduring isn't just their cleverness, it's their humanity. These weren't faceless rebels plotting in shadows, but real people working within the tightest constraints, using the only tools they had: a monk's knowledge of Latin, a brewer's understanding of fermentation, a scribe's mastery of marginalia. They remind us that oppression thrives on predictability, and that the most effective resistance often comes from disrupting the script in ways the powerful never thought to guard against. When authorities controlled the swords, the rebels wielded spoons. When laws were written in ink, they fought with erasures. The legacy of these quiet revolts lingers in unexpected places. Modern protest movements still draw from this playbook: artists hiding dissent in pop songs, activists using social media algorithms against themselves, workers slowing production with deliberate precision. The monks would have recognized these tactics instantly. After all, they pioneered the art of turning the system's own rules into weapons, proving that you don't always need barricades to storm the castle. Sometimes all it takes is a choir singing slightly off-key, or a ledger entry written just a little too truthfully. So which of these silent strikes resonates most? Perhaps it's the Bavarian scribes doodling rebellion in holy texts, or the Burgundian vintners who spoiled barrels of wine rather than let nobles profit from stolen labor. Maybe it's the Irish monks who turned candlelit vigils into secret classrooms. Whatever your pick, their stories share a common thread: that courage wears many disguises, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to perform your role as expected. Now it's your turn. Which of these quiet rebellions would you have joined? Drop your thoughts below, and if you're hungry for more stories of defiance hidden in plain sight, hit that subscribe button. History's greatest underdogs are waiting to share their secrets.